as you noted, this is a provocative title. Of course, Jesus never actually voted. But the question, I think, is something that we should take into consideration when election time rolls around. And this topic is based on a sermon that I developed in advance of a Canadian election during my internship in pastoral ministry, thinking about how our Christian priorities should inform us as we step into the ballot box. And of course, it's not exactly the same as when I first preached it, but I think it's something that can apply to Christians living in, I'll use the term broadly, liberal democracies around the world. So I'm just going to ask for the power to share a screen here so we can get into it a little bit deeper. I'll keep trying. Sorry for the dead air. There we have it. Okay, I'm just going to take a second to arrange my screens here so I can see. Now, of course, this was originally a sermon. I'm not going to preach it. I'm going to more present it today. And if you have any questions or comments as we go along, I will try to keep an eye on the group chat here. Let me just arrange things, a little dashboard setup here. Okay, I think we're good to go. All right, so how would Jesus vote? And I suppose I should put a question mark there, right? How would Jesus vote? Okay, so to start off, some basic ways that Christians have responded to elections. The first is to disengage. You would see this, for example, in the Anabaptist tradition, where worldly politics is said to be corrupt. It's a kind of a necessary evil, but one in which Christians should not participate. We should avoid contaminating ourselves with the consequences that come from elections, because there's always going to be, for every good that you do in the world, there's going to be some bad that attends it, and it would just degrade our Christian experience in order to do this. The second is to conquer, I call it. This is the idea that the gospel is to be advanced through politics, that that politics ultimately is supposed to be aimed toward the highest good of getting people into a relationship with God. And you see this in Roman Catholic and Calvinist traditions. And finally, the position I'll argue for, I'll call separate, which is that Christians should have a limited participation in politics. We should see that politics has its limits, and therefore our participation in it should be in some ways limited, but that it is meant to, that there are things that are good that Christians are meant to accomplish toward involvement in politics. And I should clarify here at the outset that by politics, I mean overall participation in human governance decisions, or in helping people to organize themselves in society. We have a sense in America, at least, and I'm in Canada, but I'm an American, that politics is inevitably partisan in some way. But it doesn't necessarily have to mean that you have partisan political loyalties you're operating out of if you're going to be involved in politics. Alan says, it seems like you're missing a fourth, more than limited, full engagement, but not in order to conquer. There may be full engagement for the well-being of your community, right? We're thinking here in terms of maybe a two cities kind of view, Augustinian, right? Lutherans are kind of this way. What you do in your political world is for politics. What you do in your religious world is for God, and we should try to not let the two get too much together. Yeah, there could be other options here. These are just three basic ones under consideration today. So how do I arrive at this? First, I'll respond to those who say disengage. And I think just a simple response to that could come out of the parable of the talents, right? Matthew chapter 24, verses 24 to 26, gives the master's response to the servant who takes what his master has given him and buries it, right? Master, I knew you were a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, gathering where you scattered no seed, so I was afraid. So I went and hid your talent in the ground, right? I was afraid I might mess it up, God, if I did too much with whatever it was you gave me, right? The word talent in our language has come to mean our natural skills and abilities, but here it simply refers to whatever God has given us that, and we're meant to improve on those things. One thing that he's given us in Canadian and American societies, other liberal democracies, is the ability to vote, right? And I think this parable is teaching us that we should not go and bury it in the ground and not use it. There may be times when the prudent thing to do is not vote, don't get me wrong, but just to rule out voting altogether seems to be, to me, to be a burying of our talents in the ground. And the response of the master is, you wicked and slothful servant, and so on and so forth, right? I don't want to get too much into his response there, but I think you take the point. Now, to those who might want to advance the gospel through politics, I think Jesus' statement, again, these are statements he makes sort of at the end of his ministry career as he's preparing his disciples to be without him. Here it's a statement to Pilate, who is judging him. Are you a king, Jesus? He says, I am a king, but my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting, that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world. That's how the ESV translates it, or of this world. There will be a time when Jesus' kingdom is of this world. That is a geopolitical entity, right? It will be when he comes back and conquers all the other kingdoms. But that we live in that time between. Right now, his kingdom is not of this world. We are not to try to advance the gospel by the use of the sword. This seems to be a principle Jesus is handing down, and we could try to establish it elsewhere as well. But this, I think, is his clearest explanation of this. Okay, this, I think, leads us to a first basic priority that we should have when we go into the voting booth, which is that of freedom of conscience or religion. If the gospel is not to be established by means of the sword, and as one law professor has put it, the law is violence, right? For the laws of the government to have teeth, they have to have a mode of being enforced. And when it comes right down to it, that mode is state violence. And Christ is saying we do not use the sword to establish the kingdom right now. When he comes back, he'll have a sword coming out of his mouth, okay? Not literally, of course, but that's the vision and revelation of the return of Christ to conquer the kingdoms of the world. That job is not ours. So in the meantime, we need to give people freedom of conscience or religion. Anthony, can you just chat to me when I'm supposed to wrap this up by? And by the way, I had an idea in mind, but I want to double check. And I think for Adventists, this should be fairly non-controversial. That's in our DNA. But where could we look for some other basic priorities? Well, Jesus, of course, again, is Adventist now, speaking about 20 more minutes. Okay, great. We often talk about this in terms of the Sabbath, right? Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not a iota or a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Book I recommend to you is Roy Gaines' book on Old Testament law. Very important for understanding how we can apply this passage to our lives as Christians today. But the basic point here is that Jesus is not only talking about the moral law. His statement here encompasses all of the Old Testament. The law and the prophets is a way of talking about all of the books that we call the Old Testament today. And he says it's not going to be irrelevant to us until all is accomplished. Now, of course, there's more we can say here about how certain Old Testament laws apply to us more directly than others. But I think it's important to know that there is a relevance there in Old Testament law in all of it for us today. And it's not always obvious how that is. Roy's book does a lot of good work in showing how, like a framework for how we can go and find those relevances. But I think in terms of the Old Testament law that was given for the governance of Israelite society, it helps us to understand principles that we can apply in our political life today. Alan asks another question here. The application of the religious freedom principle is controversial. Are Democrats or Republicans more favorable to liberty of conscience? This is a hotly contested issue. Yeah, I'm going to try to stay out of those weeds a bit today. What I'm going to be laying out is sort of basic priorities, and you're not going to see me deal with hot button issues like abortion or same-sex marriage or pacifism. Those kinds of things are not going to come up in this conversation. It's more going to be, kind of what are the principles, broad principles that inform how we vote. I think the other hot topics kind of dig or which party is more favorable to religious liberty, right? That would require a fuller presentation in of itself. But maybe in the chat we could, or in the comments or the discussion that ensues, we could try to get into some of that if you're interested. So what I'm going to argue here is that Jesus is teaching that there's a relevance in all of Old Testament law for us today, and that includes the laws that God gave for the governance of Israelite society. And you see this within Old Testament law as well. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, Moses says, "See, I have taught you statutes and rules as the Lord my God commanded me, that you should do them in the land that you are entering to take possession of it. Keep them and do them, for that will be your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples, who, when they hear all these statutes, will say, surely this is a great nation. This great nation is a wise and understanding people." So the laws that God gave Israel were meant to be an example to the nations around, to show them how God wanted them to live, not just in terms of individual morality, I will argue, but also in terms of their social morality, the way that they would govern themselves. They were to look at what Israel was doing and say, this is good stuff. We ought to be doing it ourselves. So God's Old Testament law includes basic governance expectations for all the nations. This is the assumption that I'm going with today. Not just nations that are in a covenant relationship with him, or I should say the nation that is in a covenant relationship with him, because God only made a covenant with one nation, and that was the nation of Israel. Sometimes we forget that in American politics today. If you look at the Puritan history of the founding of the United States, there's a sort of a wish to enter into a covenant with God as Israel did, a kind of Calvinist application of Old Testament law. That's not what I'm arguing. There are certain things in the Old Testament law that are specific to Israel, that are to prepare them to receive the Messiah. And those laws we apply in our spiritual lives today. But there are also things there that just have to do with basic governance. And we can apply those as we make governance decisions in our lives today. And the way most of us do that is in the ballot box. We can see an example of this in the book of Daniel. Daniel chapter 4, where God gives Nebuchadnezzar a vision that his arrogance is about to be his downfall. And Daniel is interpreting this vision for the king. Yes, Tom says we shouldn't be limited only to the United States. I agree. And yet, here we are, right? This is an American-based presentation, so forgive me if I'm a little bit parochial, even though I sit in here in Canada. Okay, Daniel chapter 4, verse 20. "The tree you saw, which grew and became strong, so that its top reached to heaven, and it was visible to the end of the whole earth, whose leaves were beautiful and its fruit abundant, in which was food for all, under which beasts of the field found shade, in whose branches the birds of the heavens lived. It is you, O king." That's what Nebuchadnezzar was. That's who he's supposed to be, really. This is the ideal king, right? The ideal government. It's a place where people can find food and rest and really flourish in the way that a large tree in a desert can support a whole ecosystem. So also our governments are supposed to support the basic flourishing of the people in their societies. But Nebuchadnezzar had strayed from this vision. And so Daniel prophesies that he's going to have this troubles that we know come upon him. He goes insane and all of these things. But he had a chance to avoid it, right? Daniel says, "Therefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by practicing righteousness." That word there can also be translated justice. "And your iniquities by showing mercy to the oppressed, that there may perhaps be a lengthening of your prosperity." So here we have Daniel admonishing the king along the same lines that the Old Testament prophets admonished the rulers of Israel, saying, you need to stop oppressing people. You need to practice righteousness / justice in your realm, and then God's judgment will not come upon you. So what Israel had given an example in the world around, God is able to hold Nebuchadnezzar to here in this vision in Daniel. So again, basic priorities for those of us who are in nations not in a covenant relationship with God, but who need to make governance decisions based on God's principles. I think here we can find providing a just framework for society. We should make sure a government is doing that. Relieving the oppressed is a very important priority for God, especially in terms of, well, wait a minute, I skipped down. Anyway, we'll do this and then we'll go back. That'll be okay. Relieving the oppressed. And Dylan asked, how do we define what it means to be oppressed? We'll go up to back to Leviticus in a second. I skipped that. And providing for the needy. So let's find out a bit more in the Bible about what it means to be oppressed. Leviticus chapter 19, verses 9 to 10. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge. Neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. And you shall not strip your vineyard bare. Neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. There's a sense here that you have people who are in a marginal position in society, who have less access to resources, power, etc. And you are supposed to leave something for them. The oppressed are what happens when those who have resources and power and those kinds of things take advantage of those who have less, and they become the oppressed. But if they're simply the needy, we still need to look after them in certain ways. If they're oppressed, we need to give them justice. If they're simply needy, it means that we don't extract everything that we could from our economy, but we leave some things in our economy for those who also have a need, who need them more than we do, if we can put it that way. And here it highlights specifically the sojourner, the resident foreigner. That's a big topic of consideration in the Old Testament. The Israelites were resident foreigners. They were also nomads at certain points in their career, passing through other people's territory. The big enemies of God's people, the biggest enemy of God's people in the Old Testament, I would even go so far as to say, is not the Egyptians or the Babylonians, it's the Amalekites. Why? Because when Israel is passing through on their journey to Canaan, the Amalekites come out and attack the weakest ones, who are kind of the stragglers in the rear. And God really holds them to that. And the whole book of Esther is about actually how God finally repays justice on the Amalekites for what they had done to the Israelites. So God expects us to take care of the needy and the oppressed, and that's written into Old Testament law in such a way that it's supposed to become part of how they govern society. This is just a simple example. We could also tie this into the Sabbath in various ways, but I'm not going into those kinds of weeds about how it connects in with Adventist theology and things. These are just basic priorities. And then finally, We have Romans chapter 13, that famous passage about the governing authorities that we are to submit to. I think we can find some basic priorities here. They're also in the Old Testament, I think, but this passage in Romans summarizes them very nicely for us. Romans chapter 13, verses 4 to 6. For he is God's servant. Who is the he here? It's the government, basically, right? He calls it, Paul is calling it the magistrate, it's sometimes translated at, but the government is God's servant for your good. That word there for servant in Greek is the same as the word for deacon, like a deacon in the church. The government is like God's secular minister, his secular deacon, who is there for our good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. In vain means like for no reason. He is able to, we talked about the law being violence earlier. He is able to carry out effective justice here using the sword. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. There will come a time in the future when God will bring in ultimate justice in the world. He's not doing that now out of his patience and his mercy, so that people will continue to have time to repent from their wrongdoing. But before God brings in ultimate justice, there needs to be some kind of a way of offering provisional justice to people in the here and now, so that sin doesn't run all over the place rampant. That is the role of the government. He carries out a foretaste of God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience, right? Don't just obey the laws of the government because you're afraid of them, but if you're motivated by the love of Christ, your conscience should compel you to cooperate with this project of keeping evil in check. And therefore, because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God attending to this very thing. Okay, just a couple more basic priorities, and then we'll conclude. We should fund the functions of government adequately, and there's, of course, all kinds of debates about how best to do that, right? You may have heard of the Laffer curve or things like this. There seems to be a law of diminishing returns at some point. When you gather more taxes, you seem to get less actual effective government for it. I call those prudential questions, right? Those are things about which we can have debates and arguments, and that's the proper role of politics. Even partisan politics is for those who have different philosophies about how best to fund the government, to have a way to argue that out, and we can arrive at decisions together. But the point is, we need a basic agreement that we need to fund these functions of government that we've outlined as basic priorities here. And finally, number 6, the government has a role to keep the peace. And I think that expands even into the domain of international relationships. The government doesn't bear the sword in vain here. Paul is talking about how it keeps the peace within a society, but if people are attacked, the government also can provide for their security because it doesn't bear the sword in vain. But again, when it comes to this priority of relieving the oppressed, the job of the government bearing the sword is not to go out and aggressively pursue its own interests in the international realm. God rebuked the nations who did this to Israel, and he gave Israel boundaries and borders so that they wouldn't seek to have this kind of ever-expanding territory as well, right? We could go into Acts and talk about how God sets up the boundaries of nations and things like that. But there's a basic conception here of keeping the peace that we find in Scripture. So what I've argued today, just in conclusion here, is that Jesus Christ is, in fact, Lord of our votes, that we need to have basic priorities in place when we go into the ballot box. And I would further argue that these basic priorities shouldn't be overwhelmed by the hot button issues of the day. Maybe there's, I mean, we could talk about all the hot button issues that might drive people to the ballot box right now, right? But let's not allow our particular conviction and passion for a certain subject to overwhelm our sense of all the basic priorities that God expects for good governance in this world until he comes. That would be my appeal to you, because every good sermon should end with an appeal, right? That would be my appeal to you as we go into the U.S. election this fall. So I'll leave it at there.